Good evening, listeners. It's time to settle in for another chilling story of suburban suspense. From the slumbering heads of Mount Rushmore to the twin and windy cities. From the unseen depths of the Great Lakes to the rustling husks of cornfields across the heartland. Who knows what ghouls and crawling creatures lurk among us under the Midwest moon?
Several miles west of South Dakota's largest college town stood a studio of fire and molten metal, Cecil & Sons bronze casting. The front of the studio served as a souvenir shop for tourists and artists who visited the foundry for trainings. Trays of wooden-handled rock candy lined the counters beside racks of bronze keychains and barrels of pink-polished rocks. At the back of the building, behind a pair of double doors, the hot and hazardous work happened, sculptural and industrial metal casting. The studio was built of concrete with a back wall that opened like a massive garage door to accept artists' larger sculptures in need of bronzing. A few dozen yards from the foundry, just on the other side of the gravel parking lot, was the entrance to the town quarry. The craggy canyon dropped 300 feet in steep tiers, a gaping alien crater fringed with shaggy pine trees. Kyle could not imagine a better internship than working at the foundry. After a semester sweating it out under a welder's helmet and making just enough mistakes to actually learn something, he was offered an assistant position when he graduated. The project that most excited him was the town's sculpture walk, a collection of pieces that lined sidewalks in front of all the shops and restaurants downtown. Their bronze casting and brass patinas were thanks to the artists at the foundry. This year's works included a girl reading in a knothole and a lumbering Sasquatch with a spiky hide made of fork tines. Kyle's favorite sculpture was a winged diver suspended over a busy intersection. Anytime Kyle's route took him past the diver, he would crane his head out the window to study it, debating whether the figure was flying or falling. The sculpture reminded him of the Paul Buchanan song Midair, and he felt a thrill of pride for having helped cast the piece. Kyle's first weeks as a full-time employee coincided with the foundry's preparation for an art reception celebrating Vic Herney, an early trailblazer in the town's art world. Sculptures had been selected, caterers secured, and the pavilion's gallery primed for installation, but a week before the event, Cecil & Sons made the news for a different reason. The lead article in the Queen City Sentinel announced there had been a theft. One of the sculptures was missing from its downtown sidewalk display. It was among the collection's less traditional pieces, a gargoyle-like creature that crouched on a pedestal outside the Irish gastropub. Kyle hadn't had a hand in that piece, but he'd been at the studio when the artist picked it up and had felt strange about it then, a tremor of unease that he couldn't place. The news article noted that the police department had no leads as there were no obvious motives for the theft and no security cameras trained on that stretch of the walk. Kyle read how the sculpture had been separated from its bronze base as though it had stepped cleanly off. That would have required an immense amount of strength and very specific tools. Kyle wondered why the thief hadn't just unbolted the metal base from the stand. It would have been much simpler. The creature and the base were welded together. It didn't make sense. Because of the theft, artists started calling the foundry to ask about getting their unfinished sculptures back, but the staff at Cecil & Sons assured them there was no need. The foundry was already at work strengthening their security, doubling up on locks, and installing a higher-grade alarm system to ensure all the in-progress pieces were safe. The night after the sculpture went missing, Kyle stayed late at the studio. He opened the window beside his workstation to take advantage of the warm weather, rare this early in the spring. The Abbott brothers blasted from a Bluetooth boombox speckled with dried plaster as he worked. Midway through fixing up a rubber mold to start a lost wax casting, Kyle heard sudden movement outside near the building. Startled, he turned off his music to listen and heard it again. Gravel shifting and quiet grunts, then the clanging of metal clashing against metal. Kyle peered out the studio window and searched the rocky lot at the edge of the quarry, its lone streetlight nearly swallowed up by the night. He heard more gravel shifting, and just as his eyes swept the dim rim of the quarry cliff, he saw a dark shape drop below the edge. Kyle gasped. Had someone fallen? Jumped? No, he thought. The shape had been too small to be a person. It hadn't moved like a dog or a stray cat, though, and Kyle's mind fumbled for an explanation. A trick his mind played on his sleep-heavy eyes? Inclined to investigate, but quickly caving into fear, Kyle let it go, hastily cleaning his supplies and locking up for the night. He was quick to reach his car, but slow to drive away, warily eyeing the quarry edge until it disappeared behind him. The next day, Kyle relaxed some to find the studio and all the artwork inside undisturbed. No mention of anything unusual happening in the quarry worksite either. That must not have been a thief he'd heard, which was a relief, but then, who had it been? What business was there in that lot at such a late hour? Kyle spotted his mentor, RJ, making his morning coffee in the break room, and cornered him to ask if he'd ever heard activity in the quarry late at night. Did anyone ever work after dark? RJ's hands stilled from stirring his drink. His eyes widened. Why? He asked. Kyle told him what he'd heard and how he'd sworn he saw something jump over the quarry's edge the night before. RJ glanced around at the other artists passing through and told Kyle they could talk later, alone. At noon, the crew took advantage of the unseasonal heat to duck outside for lunch. When just the two of them remained in the break room, RJ passed Kyle a Pepsi and pulled up a chair beside him. RJ took a great shaky breath and began to tell Kyle a story he had carried untold for decades. Years back, when he was a teenager interning at the foundry, RJ and his friends met up late every weekend at the bottom of the quarry, like Dead Poets Society, but more Boone's Farm than Byron. Most nights were fairly uneventful, loud music and crude jokes, harmless stuff, until something unexplained happened RJ's junior year. One late spring night, the group had started a bonfire at the bottom of the quarry, circling the blaze with camp chairs. In a strange parallel to the recent theft, a bronze sculpture had gone missing that week as well. A life-size likeness of the artist Vic Herney vanished from its memorial bench in the park downtown. RJ had long forgotten what he and his friends had been talking about that night, but he remembered with unnerving clarity the way everyone's voice cut out at the same moment, how their laughter died like a snuffed wick at the sight of a bronze man walking along the edge of the bonfire's flickering glow. The figure shuffled by their group, firelight shining off his coppery hat and smooth shoulders. His movements were halting, like an early stop-motion film. Rocks crunched beneath his bronze dress shoes as his heavy legs carried him from behind an excavator to a shadowed alcove cut out of the hill opposite the bonfire. Stunned, the friends killed the fire, collected their coolers and chairs, and scrambled out of the quarry. Not a single word passed between the boys as they climbed into their cars and raced home. The following day at school, and in the weeks afterward, the friends went on as if nothing had happened, bonded in an unspoken agreement to let the terrible strangeness of that night lie. Without ever discussing it, the group started meeting up in each other's front yards and garages, never returning to the quarry. It didn't seem real then, and it doesn't seem real now, RJ said. I can't shake this anxious pit in my gut when I think of that night, and this just feels familiar. Knowing Kyle needed to work late that night to finish a commission, RJ offered to stay too. Said he could use some extra time to plan for the next class he was leading. Kyle saw through the excuse, but he let it slide, grateful for the company. That evening, as darkness settled over the quarry, Kyle got to work chasing the weld seams on a recent piece while RJ prepped for an upcoming iron pour workshop. The pair shared a comfortable silence, both absorbed in their own projects for a time, until the studio's quiet splintered with the sudden shattering of glass. The thief. An alarm sounded then, piercing and persistent as an air raid siren. RJ pressed his back to the wall before motioning for Kyle to step behind him. The two slowly stalked toward the front of the building, where the noise had sounded, prepared to confront the intruder. They edged their way closer under the studio's fluorescent lights until they reached the double doors to the front shop. In one quick motion, they pushed the doors open to find the space was empty, the lights out. Despite the dark, Kyle saw right away that a sculpture was missing from beside the front window. A crane perched on one long leg had vanished. Cautiously, Kyle and RJ approached the broken window and studied the ground in surprise. The floor beside the broken frame was clear, and all the shards of fallen glass shimmered in the dirt outside. Whoever had broken through the window had done so from the inside. The new alarm system had notified the police, and Kyle watched the glowing strobes of their electric lights in the dark, red and blue pinwheels on the black horizon. On arrival, one officer surveyed the area while his partner questioned the two men. She asked if anything was missing, and RJ gave her a description of the bronze crane. Another theft, then, the officer responded. Kyle and RJ said nothing. When they finished with their questions, the police took some photos and helped to clean up the glass. Together, the four created a cover to patch over the broken window. Only afterward, as the officer's cruiser pulled away, did Kyle meet RJ's gaze. Uncertain fear crystallized into knowing terror at RJ's color-drained face. Kyle's eyes traveled to the quarry outside the window. No, RJ said, in answer to an unasked question. We're not going down there. Go home. Get some sleep. We'll talk tomorrow at the reception. Kyle heard the ragged edge of panic in RJ's words and watched how worry tensed his shoulders like puppet strings pulled taut. Kyle was grateful for RJ's anxiety. It would save him from having to confront his staggering fear of depths, of heavy rock and earth rising above him. Kyle thought of the first time he looked down into the black maw of the unlit quarry at night, how the other foundry artists had joked that the quarry was bottomless and dropped down forever. If only, Kyle thought now, he knew there was a bottom and was terrified of what lived there. The next day, when Kyle and RJ arrived at the gallery downtown, they entered to find the front foyer draped with metallic streamers and a black and white banner announcing the Vince Herney Memorial Art Show. A waiter appeared from a side door and shared that the catering staff was prepped and would begin serving hors d'oeuvres as soon as the first guests arrived. RJ thanked the waiter, who smiled and headed back through the door, before turning on his heels to add, "I brought the pieces from the alley in, too." "What pieces?" RJ asked. "The bird and the gremlin-looking one," he said. At Kyle and RJ's stunned silence, the waiter continued, "I was careful with them. I wouldn't have touched them, but it didn't seem safe to let them sit in the street." "Those aren't part of the show," Kyle said. "Oh, my mistake. I just assumed... Well, either way, I'll show you where I put them," the waiter offered. Unnerved, Kyle and RJ followed him through a velvet-curtained hallway leading to another gallery twice the size of the foyer. On a table beside the doorway sat the missing sculptures, the crane perched protectively over the leering gargoyle. "How?" Kyle started. RJ stood speechless for several moments before collecting himself. "We should take these back to the studio," he finally said, his voice several times more resolute than his face suggested. Kyle and RJ approached the sculptures and lifted them slowly, cautiously. Kyle walked the gargoyle as far away from his body as his arms allowed, as though he held a sleeping wolf that could wake at any moment and attack him. They carried the sculptures out to RJ's truck, loading them into the rusty bed to take back to the foundry. The whole drive out, Kyle kept an anxious eye over his shoulder, watching the creatures through the back window of the cab. Storm clouds rolled low over the quarry as they drove up, pulling around to the studio garage door. Suddenly, before RJ had come to a full stop, a piercing metal creaking came from the back of the truck as the bronze crane lifted itself into the air on its metallic wings. An instant later, the gargoyle stepped out of its hunched pose and leapt over the tailgate, hobbling across the gravel below and rushing toward the quarry. The creatures dropped over the edge into the dark of the quarry before Kyle or RJ could process the scene. "No," Kyle moaned. This isn't real." Fear burned through Kyle's chest like a soldering iron, and he turned to run, but RJ caught him by the sleeve and held his grip, despite Kyle's thrashing attempts to break free. "I'm terrified too, but I can't keep avoiding this, whatever's going on. We have to investigate." Kyle stilled. "Please," RJ whispered, pleading. It was the most shaken Kyle had ever seen RJ. Afraid as he was to trek down into the pit, he couldn't imagine letting RJ go it alone. And so they ventured down, slow-stepping over loose rocks and searching the ground around their feet with their flashlights. Halfway down, the two heard skittering in the gravel and larger stones tripping down the wall beside them. They wheeled toward the sound but saw nothing. Dread settled deeper as they continued their descent. Finally, after much fear and fumbling in the dark, the two reached the bottom of the quarry. They kept close and walked slowly, like spacemen exploring a fearful planet. Just as they approached the center of the pit, Cal's flashlight started to flicker. He slapped its side to realign the batteries, and when the light shone full force again, Kyle saw in its narrow beam two metal creatures, the slender crane and gnarled gargoyle. Their shiny bodies hunched close as if in conversation, not at all the original poses their artists had created. In that instant, both creatures' heads snapped towards the men. Kyle and RJ froze, their resolves softening like clay beneath a carving knife. Wordlessly, the men abandoned their mission and sprinted the way they came. In moments, the two had traveled the quarry floor and begun the hike back up. Kyle's breath came quick and shallow as he hurried to ascend, his fear of deep pits suddenly dominated by the menace of the creatures below. Beside him, RJ scrambled up the steep wall as quickly as his large frame could carry him. Fear-soaked adrenaline propelled them along at a steady clip and numbed them to the twisted ankles and scraped hands they suffered in their hurry. Breathless from fear and exertion, they neared the top of the quarry, scrambling to ascend the final stretch, when they looked up to see someone blocking their exit, a figure sitting atop the cliff wall. Kyle shone his flashlight up to illuminate a man, his bronze legs swinging over the edge and bronze face carved in a shadowed grin.